All right, guys, and welcome everyone, viewers at home, viewers live and abroad.
All
Welcome
the
to another.
broad viewers.
That's right.
Rod, we have a wide range of
That's right.
viewership.
Welcome to another episode of Three Friends Who Hate Each Other. Today, we're going to be discussing death and the afterlife, sort of brainstorming, picking each other's minds on what we believe about death and the afterlife, how it affects our day to day, how it affects how we live, how we define meaning, our views on the afterlife, why we believe it. And we'll kind of touch on what other cultures, what other belief systems view, what they believe about death and the afterlife. And then we have time, we'll discuss a little bit about fear and dying, euthanasia. What's wrong with the euthanasia?
Is that
That was an Ollie G reference.
Ali G,
As soon as I said
literally
I just heard Ollie G saying,
Exhibit A,
euthanasia.
why I hate you.
I love that. It's like that's euthanasia. What's wrong with the euthanasia?
Yeah.
It's classic.
And a little bit about maybe near-death experiences, what we think of them and what they could or couldn't mean. So I think it's a general rule we can say that most people are enjoy life. They don't want to die. The only thing I could think of course, is if you just had such a miserable existence. An example, if you had some form of terminal illness or you're in a state of continual torture, intolerable pain, you might find death as a release to end that. But would that be a release? Is it better to live? Is it better to die? The only thing I could think of why it would be better to die would be if you were in such intolerable pain. What do you guys, Dave? What do you guys think about that?
About what?
About is life? Well, first, is life worth living? And I know that I forgot in one of the book. I think it was I forgot what the book was called, but there would be like a machine where you could put in money and take a pill if you wanted to basically kill yourself. I know it's getting kind of dark, kind of early, but
Do it.
Is life worth living? And if so, why? What would the circumstances be for where you would prefer death over life?
Am I going first, Adam, or you?
I'm marinating on it for a second. Go ahead if you got something.
Sure. Is life worth living? Yeah, sure. I mean,
First off, you probably started by asking the ultimate wrong person to answer this question right out of the game.
fair. Yeah. Yeah, you can't really sway me either way. I mean, yeah, sure, life is worth living, I guess. I would say, so in this conversation, death and life is also sort of couched in that conversation of the afterlife thing. And without getting too much into that, like, it also kind of depends on what alternatives there are. And similar to, like, Josh, your example of, like, if you're in excruciating torture, if life becomes overwhelmingly suffering, then yeah, then suddenly the idea of just not existing, not having life would suddenly become more appealing than living. So yeah, in those extreme situations. Also, I think if there was like sort of like this Sisyphus situation, Groundhog Day, to use a less philosophical term, then yeah, like that maybe.
Quite a jump, Dave. Quite a jump.
Really, it's not when you think about it. But yeah, like just that you're doomed to sort of do the same thing and repeat all the time. That would certainly be, I think, something that would attract me to find the exit. Yeah, I also think that like life, given the parameters of what we do and do not know, and that we're sort of shrouded in just existence, that sort of, shitty cliche of like life, the experiences of life are like it's worth its own merit. Like I kind of agree with that. Like this is the only existence we know we have. Maybe there's better ones, maybe there's worse ones, but there are positives in this life, and like living that life, just it is its own reward just having it. So I do think in the end it is worth it. But it's not like a runaway parade every day. So
Yeah, I could see that. I mean, like, not to sound like a graduation card, but like life is ultimately like what you make it. And so, like, if your life is truly worth living, you would think that you are probably creating experiences which you find fulfillment in. And whatever fulfillment is to a person, I mean, that's all like dependent um, on that own person's kind of like view of the world and what's and their values. But at the same time, for people that aren't finding any kind of fulfillment, they would make the decision or the assumption, and I'm sure most people who probably take their own lives prematurely would make this decision that, or come to the conclusion in their own minds that their life is not worth living. So, I mean, like, it's a very general question, completely dependent on someone else's perception of their life. Now, someone could, somebody who suffered a loss or has chronic depression or something like that can rationalize in their mind that their life literally isn't worth living. But in so many cases, when someone does take their own lives, there are always a number of people who can point to different things that should have provided meaning or fulfillment in that person's life. I mean, from my experience, obviously, like, life is very much worth living because I'm obviously still here despite Dave's best efforts. And I mean, like, I have a family and I have friends. Don't mean to brag, Dave, but it's and it brings me a lot of fulfillment. Like, the work that I do brings me a lot of fulfillment. So, I mean, ultimately, like, is life worth living? I would say yes. Many people would say no, but they would probably have quite a number of people in their lives that would actually beg to differ.
Yeah. So go ahead, Dave.
I was going to add, like, it sounded like Adam, and I know we prefaced with like not trying to be cliche, but very much kind of sounded like the unexamined life is not worth living, that sort of thing. But it made me think of other Greek philosophy. But Seneca is who had that line that was like, "Life without courage for death is slavery. Life without the courage for death is slavery." And I really liked that. And just that idea about, like, if you live your whole life just to try to avoid this thing, then you're not actually living it. You're a slave to just being in existence. And that, like, you have to confront the fact of death and live life to the fullest in that sense. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what I ended up thinking about when Adam was talking about that, of like finding those things in whatever sort of you find meaning or value in, and then imbuing your life into those things.
I think about death. I mean, not a lot. I mean, who knows what a healthy amount is, relative to how much other people think about death and time.
3 hours a day, maybe
right.
3.5.
But you try to come to terms with death, and no matter how much you like think about, like, I'm gonna die, and try to, like, well, I hope it's a long time down the road. I don't know if there's anything you can do to really prepare you for that moment of the unknown, like just not really knowing what's going to happen. And to go back to someone who commits suicide, I never got why there's been such hostility in most religious traditions, I think, to the suicide. And I'm a big fan. Well, I was a real big fan of G.K. Chesterton. Not as much anymore. But I remember in one of his books, Orthodoxy, he talks about the suicide, and he said this thing that when I first read it sounded clever, but then I was just like, no, that really doesn't make sense. He said, like, the person who murders someone, they take one life away. They take one person's life away, the murderer. But the suicide, he takes all life away because he doesn't think life's worth living, so he shuts down the entire world. So he uses that to, I think, to make it look like the suicide is such a bad person, that he's not just killing one man, he's killing all men by destroying his mind and his perception of reality. But I just think that gives such a negative perception on someone who must be in such mental or physical pain that they're willing to go above and beyond that, I biological, spiritual, whatever innate sense of wanting to live, and whether it be mental illness, and that instinct doesn't kick in, and to just go over that hump and to really just end your own life. Like, I'm not trying to romanticize it at all, but I just think that someone who's willing to do that is in much more need of like compassion than ridicule. And I think we do a bad job as a society. I think it's getting better as mental illness awareness and mental health is starting to take root. But anyway, I just wanted to point that out.
Well, if I can kind of jump on what you just said, like I think that it's kind of like, yeah, I feel like sort of what you described is a lot kind of like how people talk about like dealing with a loved one who has Alzheimer's, where it's kind of like the disease doesn't affect the victim as much as the people that are around them. And I kind of think, whether it's mental illness or even like leading to suicide as kind of like the end game, like so much of the tragedy isn't found in that person's act upon themselves necessarily, as much as how that act affects those that are around them, like those that tried to help or those that loved them, or and so like, I mean, I think depending on the circumstances the person would be in that chooses to end their own life, whether it's chronic pain or mental illness, in some cases, I would feel like whatever those circumstances were, like the severity of them, the more that somebody could kind of empathize with the state and the mental state in which the person was in at the time or had experienced for a prolonged period or whatever, I think what that would do would ultimately give those around them maybe an earlier sense of closure. But I don't think that it would really ultimately take away from like the tragedy in itself. I mean, any life loss is ultimately like a tragedy, and whether that person was in pain or was in distress or whatever, like unless somebody lives in complete isolation, I would really find it hard to believe that somebody, who takes their own life would be completely absent of somebody who wouldn't mourn them. I mean, like, to obviously use like the extreme example, I mean, Hitler killed himself. A lot of people don't mourn that. And I'm not saying that like, I'm not saying that I like really wish he would have like just, hung in there. But there are certainly people around him that viewed that as like an ultimate tragedy. I don't, but Joseph Goebbels certainly did, right? And Dave. But but I mean that whole idea of, you can see like, oh yeah, like this guy, he didn't have a life worth living. He pretty much like his existence was encapsulated in causing other people pain and suffering and loss, but yet that very person still had people that mourn them. So again, like it's like if people live in total isolation, maybe they don't have people that would mourn them, but I would assume somebody who doesn't certainly would. And would probably point to different examples in which even a person who is as certain as anything else that they should end their life, and that's the only meaning that what their life could bring would probably point to something in which like the person had something to live for.
Yeah. Yeah, with that, that's a good example too, because if you have someone who has chronic depression or some form of mental illness and they kill themselves, maybe they're thinking this life is so terrible, whatever is after this must be better, whether it's nothingness or some form of afterlife, it must be better. Whereas Hitler, he killed himself, taking a coward's way out. It's all over. What I've been doing is coming to an end. I don't want to have to face the music. What he must have thought about the afterlife is maybe there, who knows, but like I think that's an interesting thing where how you view the afterlife does kind of influence how you view death, and whether or not it's worth killing yourself under certain circumstances, or it helps with your fear of dying, or your, like Dave mentioned with that one quote, being courageous in the face of death. So based off that, about how your view of the afterlife affects your view of dying, what do you guys think personally about the afterlife, and how does that affect your view of dying?
Dave?
How do we view the afterlife, and how does my view of death affect
How does your
the afterlife
how does your
affect my
view of
view
the afterlife affect how your
of death?
your view of death, or your apprehension of it, or your welcoming of it?
Yeah. I mean, so my view, I don't believe that there is an afterlife. Yeah, when you die, that's it. You are consciously no longer existing. Well, in any dynamic, you're not existing really, outside of a cadaver. So my view is, yeah, this life is it. So obviously that would affect my view of death, because that's like the last chapter. That's it. There isn't any prologue of any sort. So yeah, I certainly am adverse to death, simply because it is the last thing. And there's an interesting way of like thinking about this, which is like,
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but I totally pegged you as a person that was pro-death. Really surprised by that. But okay, go on. Dave is not pro-death. I'm going to put
I
that in
mean,
my
for
notes.
certain people,
Fair.
But yeah, like I think so. Two things I would say about this. Like, I don't know if my view of death would be any different, and I don't know, outside of like philosophically, I understand for certain people it is. I think all we've ever known is existence, and so the idea of that changing, I think, is like strange and adverse to everyone. Even if you believe like, well, there's an afterlife, the only thing you've ever known to exist is going to stop. And I think everyone would kind of have like, well, shit, what happens then? Like, what's that about? And be sort of concerned about it. And so I have that same sort of trepidation about like not existing anymore. So, and also coming back to the other thing you kind of said with that, I don't know how much. I was just thinking about like in terms of the suicide, and this seems like a tangent we don't have to go down too much, or people who struggle with depression, in that, as someone who has struggled with depression for like almost 30 years, including some severe depression, who has thought about dying, I don't know if that change. Like, I don't know, are suicide rates amongst people who are believers different than people who are non-believers? Like, are non-believers more likely to commit suicide, or are believers more likely to commit suicide because they're like, this shit sucks, and then I'll go to the better place, and so like they're more easy to cop out because they know there's something better. I don't know. I don't think it would be, just from my personal understanding of depression, but yeah, I don't know about that. But to answer the question, like, yeah, obviously my view of death is pretty heavily shaped by, I think, in part, my view of the afterlife, because I don't think there is one. So death is the last thing. And I'd like to avoid it.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'm going to offer a very like meandering, not rebuttal, but like continuation of kind of like that thought. So, as somebody who's kind of like reevaluating a lot of my preconceived notions about what I thought I knew about the Christian faith and reality as a whole, I would kind of like ask this question to briefly like meander from this point for just a second. What do you think? What do you think a soul is?
Who are you asking?
Both of you guys. It wasn't rhetorical. I don't know why Josh is muted right now, but
My dog. Can you guys hear my dog or no?
Not at this present
No.
moment.
no.
Okay, good. I think a soul. I don't know. I mean, I guess there's a couple ways of viewing it. It could either be the essence of our being, um, sort of that divine spiritual reality, or it could just be us, like our soul is who we are.
Mhm.
Like when we die, we could just be dead. There doesn't have to be a disembodied spiritual existence that goes someplace else. Our soul could just be who we are, like our being. Um, and then, when we die, we're dead. But I think part of the Christian hope is resurrection. So God could resurrect you again as a person, and you'd have a
As a
new
physical
body.
being?
I think it'd be like it could take on physicality, but I think it would be like maybe spiritually,
The soul.
dominated. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So the soul, I don't necessarily think of it as like a disembodied spirit that's like separate from you. I think the soul is like who you're being. Like my soul is like who I am, like just a person. You know what I mean?
I would
So, do you
agree with what
mean
Josh said. I think that. I just don't think it. I don't think it's transcendental. So I think your soul is like I'm more than just a makeup of this biological thing and the collection of cells.
thank
There's
God?
something like deeper there. That's the soul. But I don't think that's metaphysical or anything. I think when I die, it dies. So, but yeah.
Okay, because I'm not asking that question to like have some kind of like snarky comeback or anything, because like literally, I mentioned this before, a few talks that we had ago about when my wife and I were in Canada and we went to this museum,
Of God.
and they had an exhibit on the history of God.
Yeah.
And yeah, again, just very, it was really cool because it wasn't like an agenda. It was almost like an expose on how different people, different cultures perceive God. And they had these video recordings of different people explaining what they believed of the afterlife. And so there would be people who identified as Christians, and they would have different examples. I heard Charlie that time. Son of a bitch, literally. That would have very different explanations of what they thought the afterlife was like. But there was one man who was Jewish, and I can't remember if he said that he was strictly kind of like ethnically Jewish, culturally Jewish, or if that was kind of like his religious expression or not. But essentially, he talked about like, I'm not really sure about the afterlife, and I feel like whatever would happen when I die, if I go to some other place or some other like existence, my consciousness would not be really aware of that. And so it was kind of like a nihilistic approach of like, well, like I die and kind of like there could be something happens. I don't know. And if something did happen, I would not be aware of it at all. And so it kind of like, it really got me thinking about this, because like all of our experience is kind of like processed through our brain and our consciousness. And I mentioned this before about how even when we talk about, like that spiritual sense of ourselves, all of that stuff is ultimately filtered through like a physical filter. Like your mind, your consciousness is like a physical, a physical process of external stimuli and like internal
Neurons.
cognizance. Yeah. And so when I think about like what I personally believe about the afterlife is kind of like, well, the Bible kind of has like, coming from a Christian background, the Bible has like some very vague expressions of what the afterlife might be like.
Mm-hmm.
And it's good to know that in a lot of those descriptions, like the type of literature in which like it's written and how Christians today understand or believe they understand what heaven is like, or of course like the afterlife, like those are done in like poetry formats where like the person's kind of like doing like broad examples, broad assumptions, broad themes and descriptions of what the afterlife is like. And I feel like from my perspective, what I had been sort of expected to believe as a young Christian in a very like fundamentalist church was that these are descriptions just like if you were to read a guidebook of like the Rocky Mountains. Like there's very finite like routes. There's very finite like this is what it is going to be like. But to me, it just like doesn't really add up. And that's not to say that there isn't an afterlife or that I don't really believe in an afterlife. It's just that ultimately, like I cannot like in good conscience claim any firm understanding of what the afterlife is like. And ultimately, if I'm like living this life so that I can get some kind of reward at the end, all of like the compassion, all of the fairness, all of the patience that I have in this life is ultimately like disingenuous. And like for me, that kind of goes back on like a lot of tenets that I feel like is beautiful about Christianity, in that like this like as a Christian, I'm expected to essentially live a life that that is full of examples of like what I believe. If Jesus lived the life that I'm supposed to model in terms of like the virtues of his teachings and his examples, I shouldn't be doing that so that I can get this reward in the end. Like if I'm a teacher, okay, it's a very non-glamorous, it's does not pay very well. And so what keeps me coming back is ultimately like the fulfillment that I have in my job and the love that I have for my students. Like there's nothing else. And if I was doing that job only for the paycheck, like I could not do this job anymore. It would not, it's just simply not worth it. And ultimately, like kids would be able to sniff out the fact that like I don't enjoy what I'm doing. And so I feel like it's kind of the same way when you're living this, if you're truly living this life for the purpose of some kind of reward or experience in some kind of afterlife, you're ultimately betraying the virtues that you're trying to project onto the people that you interact with or the people that are in your community. So for like me, I don't think about the afterlife and I don't really care if there's a heaven or there's a hell, because ultimately like what gives my life meaning and what could possibly determine where I'm going to end up is ultimately like what I do here. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, I get it. I mean, I totally understand what you're saying. From my perspective,
Wrong. I thought that's where he was going with that. No, I get what you're saying. From my expression, that's all shit.
no. Like the only thing that I would say differently is that if I am going to live in this existence, in this life, you want to live well. Like you want to be you want to have your hierarchy of needs met. You know what I mean? You want to be healthy. You want to have a place to live, food to eat, loved ones. If you're not living well, whether it be your own fault or other circumstances, um, I just think that the hope uh, of something else better being after this, and of course, even people in the Old Testament, we talked about this before. There wasn't really a developed
Yeah.
idea of the afterlife. So people lived worshiping God, doing all these things for its own sake. There wasn't. It was about this life, about living well and having shalom or whatever, a peace with everything. But if that isn't a factor, or if that's not possible, I just feel like for so many people, like death, and in America, like we're so blinded to it. Like we hear about things on the news, but even things on the news almost just seems like another type of movie or something that's not real because it's on television. Like just the amount of lives that come into existence and just pass away tragically, children, um, you know, uh, anyone, for whatever reason. I just think that if there wasn't a hope of something better for everyone, like that sense of justice of making things right, um, then people were really kind of gypped out on life, whatever life is. You know what I mean? And that's not so much a way of like trying to live a certain way to attain afterlife, so I don't like burn in hell or I get to appreciate the fruits of heaven or whatever. But it's more or less just people being able to experience what life could be, and that just seems like a bigger tragedy and a travesty of existence um, than anything else. And even for myself, life's pretty good right now, but like to think that would be a time where like I wouldn't be able to be with the people I loved, like that's going to come to an end. Like if that is true, then I think life is like tragic, even for someone who has a good existence. It might even be even worse. You know what I mean? If you have loved ones and you spend time with them, but it's all going to be for naught because once you're dead, you'll have no recollection of it ever happening in the first place. That just seems completely um, fatalistic. Like, I don't know. That's kind of how I think about it.
Hmm.
So, two questions I have on this, what you're saying. One, in reverse order. The second one being like the way you talked about like that we wouldn't have any recollection of that. So, are you sort of denying or rejecting like what sounds like Adam is saying, that like even if there's this afterlife, the idea that we would be connected to it, like we could live eternally, but we may not really have any, or like not eternally, but like have another one, but we wouldn't really have a strong connection to this present life. I wouldn't remember either anything or everything, at least from this one. I'd be very disconnected from it. Are you saying no to that because then you wouldn't realize like what was wrong in that life is being rectified in this life, so it's okay? And then the second question on that is, so are you saying, is that what you think? Because it sounded like you're saying like you understand the idea that since this life is unjust and suffering, the best way to rectify that or address that is to fulfill justice, is that the next life fixes that and does reprieve suffering in individuals and rectifies things and blah blah blah. So yeah.
The first part, I don't know. I wasn't necessarily disagreeing with Adam. I guess what I was just saying was, if there is an afterlife, I think it would make sense, and it would be, it seems to me it would be good if you did have that knowledge of before, sort of like a before and after, your
Mm-hmm.
experience here and how it affects your experience in the hereafter. And then that I think that I believe that it's a basis of like hope, and if I think it should be true, not just because of how all the things that are wrong in the world, but of kind of like how we're wired, um, and how life sort of is. What was the second part of your question? What was the second question again?
I wasn't clear if you were sort of theorizing or philosophizing about like this heaven would and should look like this to address these things, if that's what you actually thought, that that place has to basically correct the incorrections here.
Well, I think it should, and I think it would if a place like that existed. And obviously, no one knows, but I think that at least gives you the hope. And I think that's one of the main factors that gave the ancient Israelites hope in a belief, progressive belief in resurrection, is that they had suffered all these injustices of exile and going back. And if they're God's people, how are all these bad things happening? There must be something else. God must resurrect the nation, to the new world, to the new kingdom, so to speak. And I think that developed into resurrection, and I think that makes sense not just for them but for the world. You know what I mean?
Do you?
For Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
And I don't want to go too far off course here, but like I would almost take that from a sociological perspective as, I don't want to say evidence, but like an argument for why it doesn't exist. Meaning, in sort of cultural narrative forms of how we, as Clifford Geertz would say, the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, like how we mythologize and narrate. Like, so the
You're
Jews
talking
have
about
this,
the big red dog, right?
yeah, and so he sits on
Okay,
that.
cool. Yeah,
Like how the Jews have this idea that God will sanctify this land, and then when we get like all our dominoes in row, basically God will come down, Yahweh will descend and like rule the earth from Jerusalem, and like everything will be set right. And as like time kind of went on, when they're like, well, shit, this isn't happening, and like it started to think like it may never happen because we keep getting destroyed and like new invasion, that then they would have this spin of like, well, so it's not going to happen yet, but like in the next one, like there will be a second try, and then God's going to do this, and then because their ideas weren't even like we're going to go to this special place. It was like God will reconstitute this shit, and like this all will all be set up and right, and like we'll sort of be risen from the dead here on earth and sort of have this thing that like since time's running out for him to do that here on earth, what we think will happen, it'll happen post death again. And so them sort of trying to make sense of the reality not comporting with their views, that they would sort of come up with this, which, yeah, as you said, like it does evolve, it does change. I also think it's weird that like there isn't really a good idea of what heaven in sort of a Judeo-Christian view is. Because like when Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven, is that a physical place on earth or is that a heaven thing? Because it looks really weird and vague in ways. It just looks like justice or whatever. And then like Revelations, is that what heaven will look like? This vision of the future end time? Like, yeah, it's kind of all over the map. So,
Right.
yeah, and I think this is a good point where I want to jump in. And Josh, you can relate to this. There was a book that I had to read when I went to Christian college, and it was written by a professor at the theological seminary. And it was called "Heaven is a Place on Earth." And essentially what it was dispelling this like Platonic philosophical influence on Christian thought, whereby I can say Christian evangelicals are kind of under this assumption that there's like this dualism between like the spiritual realm and the physical realm. And that's kind of a part or in an effect of how Platonic philosophy really influenced early Christian thought. As much as like we can love reading Augustine and feel like it's so incredibly profound, like his reality was like inescapable from Platonic philosophy of like that dualist nature. But ultimately, like if you're solely looking at the creation story, whether you believe it or not, that's irrelevant. If you can look at it just simply as analogy or like literal 6-day creation, like I don't care. But um, the moral of the story is that ultimately, like that God created the earth for people. Like that's the moral of the story. Like this is here, it was created for you. Now, I mean, you can start like parsing the fall, like the elements of the fall, like there are split hairs on that, but there's no indication that like the Garden of Eden was kind of like um a separate reality. Like it's not like um it's nowhere else but on earth. Now, like whether there was an actual Garden of Eden, like that's irrelevant. It's like looking at the idea of like creation was created for mankind that was ultimately created as well. And so like this idea that eventually when we die we're just going to go away from this fallen, sinful, horrible place, that was what the author was trying to like get away from. Like the original intent, like God's plan was for this earth to be for his creation, like his people. And like I can't help but think of like that old hymn that we probably all heard in church, like this place is not my home, I'm just passing through. And the author actually used that in his book about like this is like the antithesis of what the original intent was. And so for me, like I kind of weigh that concept with my view of the afterlife, whether that is something else or whether that's actually just like a rejuvenated earth. Like I don't know what it will be, and again I don't know if I'll be even conscious of those changes. But like in terms of like other realms and locations, from a Christian perspective, it's really hard to assume that the afterlife would be anywhere else but in earth. And for me, it was like questioning everything that I assumed that I thought I knew about the Bible and my faith. To me, it's kind of like a reevaluation of like, is this really kind of like a big analogy for ultimately like this place was created for us? We're going to die, and our afterlife is essentially being spent in this place. And now, um, whether that's just kind of like depreciating in the ground, or whether that's elevating into some other kind of like consciousness, I really don't know.
Yeah. No, and I agree with that take of it's not so much this realm and the spiritual realm. It's if when you die, maybe we just we are like soul sleeping, as they say, and then God restores the creation for all people and rights wrongs. And obviously, I know there's a bunch of questions with that and difficulties with that, but for me, it boils down to how I view the afterlife, or how I view, I guess eternity, or what happens next, sort of determines and dictates how I think about this life. So for me, if this life is all there is, and whether or not there's a God or not, I don't know. I just think that it's sort of that thing, like if this is all there is, then eat, drink, be merry, for tomorrow we die. Like that does resonate with me. Like, and I don't know if it's just a personality type, or some people can resonate with that, some people don't. But I think for certain people, it's like not an accountability thing where, well, the only reason why you're good is because you think God exists. It's not that. It's what's the purpose of who I am as a person, and how does how does that relate to what's going to happen in eternity? it means everything or it means like nothing. Because if I do just die and rot in the ground and this is all there is, then I think I would be, much more of um, just like very cynical and
Mhm.
let that play out into who I am as a person. And that's just, and I think that's just how I'm wired. You know what I mean? And I think a lot
Mhm.
of people could probably relate to that, and maybe a lot don't. And I'm
Mhm.
not saying it as like, oh, Christians are only good because God exists. I'm not even talking about like God existing or not. I'm saying maybe God does exist, but if this is still all there is, and I die and that's it, then what am I doing? Like, you know what
Mhm.
I mean? Like,
Yeah,
what
well,
is it all for?
yeah, and I remember when I was in when I went to Greece on a study abroad trip, the professor that took us on this, he had actually done his doctoral dissertation on like, oh gosh, I can't remember the time period, but it was essentially on like tombstones, and it was like ancient Near Eastern tombstones from like some specific period, and essentially his thing about like the view of the afterlife of the Greeks, like with all the mythology and everything, like there was also sort of like this disconnect from like, the what most people would understand of like Hades and all that kind of stuff. And essentially like they would have these like long tombstones for people who accomplished a lot. So like somebody like Pericles or um, some other Greek hero who we know was like a real person. So there's no tombstone for Achilles. They had a tomb for him, but that's beside the point. Essentially, like people who would accomplish a lot or like demonstrated like the best of Athenian culture would have these like larger monuments that wasn't just like a statue, but kind of like a chronology of their achievements for the purpose of people would walk through these things. Because when we were in one ancient cemetery, it was like in the middle of Athens. It's like you walk out of a Starbucks and there's this place being excavated like in the center of the city, and probably would have been like one of the centers of the city thousands of years ago. And there's these like really big um, inscriptions in these tombstones for the purpose of people would walk by and remember their dead, and they would read like why this person was important, and it was almost like a bullet pointed like presentation, like this person did this and this and this and this, for the purpose of people read their story and are inspired by it or contemplate it. And that is a way of kind of allowing the spirit of that person. And I mean, like, spirit, not in the sense of like a kind of like an extra physical sense, but more of like a more of like an essence, like the essence of
Who
that
they were.
person, as yeah, who they were, as long as their story is continually told and has some kind of effect on those that come after them, that's allowing that person, their essence, to essentially live forever. Um, and so, beyond the point of just like reaching this period, reaching this end game of I did this and I did that, and so now I'm in heaven. Like for me, my motivation isn't necessarily like the end game, because I'm completely out of control of what happens after I die. I have no way of that I know of to respond or deal with that. It's just simply maybe predetermined, or there's nothing at all. Um, and so for me, like my motivation for what I do, what I think, why I view the things that I do is ultimately because, like, when I die, the people that come after me, I'm like thinking of my kids, I'm thinking of like the people that are around me, my family, like how they know me. Can I leave something more than a very good looking corpse? And maybe something that kind of inspires people to do good.
The corpse.
That wasn't a necrophiliac joke. I know that you were really hoping for one. Yeah.
Any other thoughts on that?
Not right now.
It's now or never. This might be the only time we ever have, Dave.
No, I don't. I'm good.
All right. So what about near-death experiences? Do you guys want to talk about near-death experiences or no?
I'm cool talking about all of this. You pick the order.
Okay, let me just say this one thing about near-death experiences.
They're all real.
For someone who, again, I grew up in like a very fundamentalist church, and I went to a Pentecostal high school and was exposed to a lot of testimonials where people were very, very sincere about their near-death experience and were very willing to share about that. Okay, so that's where I'm coming from.
Oh no, that was it. The whole thing was open-ended.
Yeah, and so like no, I'm sorry, I was swallowing because again,
Oh,
like,
sorry.
I've had a cough and I don't want to like start coughing right now, so I'm trying to
I
suppress
got
it. So, from my experience, and by experience, I mean I took a neurological psychology class almost 20 years ago. That when you deprive the brain of oxygen, it does not work properly.
Mm-hmm.
So, for people, and I 100% believe that like people have like clinically died and have been able to like been resuscitated. Um, I truly believe that those near-death experiences say more of how those people view heaven than or the afterlife than what the afterlife actually is. I think that it's very, very strange that even people in the evangelical world who claim to have had these experiences, they don't all line up. And so for me, I mean, like you could say like, oh, well, maybe this person didn't have a near-death experience. Like, you're right. Maybe they actually did it. And so there's really no way of knowing what is true and what is not. And ultimately, again, and this is in like support of Christianity, is the fact that that is a faith. There are elements of it that should not be able to be proven. Because when something is proven, there's no longer any need to have faith in it. Like I have zero faith in gravity because I know that it's there and I experience it. There's no way for me to understand the world without something like that that I can physically see. No, I can't touch it, but I experience it. And so for the idea that this afterlife is going to be substantiated based on somebody who almost died, coming back and saying, oh, heaven's for real, because when I was dead on the operating table, I went to heaven and God said, you're not quite ready yet. Like that to me, like doesn't line up with any of the other understandings of Christianity or like that worldview. Like that is kind of like pop spirituality. That's kind of like, it's like junk food for spirituality, really. It's like something to make people feel good and feel validated of their worldview, not something that truly validates their worldview or gives any kind of like substantial like consideration to that person's worldview. That's what I view about near-death experiences. And cede the rest of my time to the gentleman from Chicago.
Um, I
And
mean,
yes, I 100% watched via subtitles the ouster of Kevin McCarthy from the House of Representatives last week, because that's what brings my life a lot of meaning and excitement.
hey man, C-SPAN's getting real. Okay.
Right?
Um, yeah. In terms of like, I agree with Adam. I think that was really succinct. Um, I think, yeah, just because of what we understand from like medical procedures and medical emergencies, like we know what goes on in the brain. And literally, there have been doctors who have talked about near death experiences, but like, this is when you are your least reliable. Like, this is when you should be counting on your cognitive abilities the least. And you're drawing these huge conclusions from them. Um, and also there's been ones that they've tested, like they've gone to there was like various like operating surgical rooms where they would put notes facing up on the top of like bookshelves that are like 8 feet high, and people would be like, I got up and I was out of my body and I floating around the room, and they're like, oh, what did the note say on top of the bookshelf? And they're like, what notes? And it's like, yeah, you didn't, because like we're actually trying to run tests to see if you did, and you clearly didn't. And conversely, like it was actually pointed out, as I mentioned before this, that there was an article. This was a number of years ago that I came across it, like 8, 9 months ago or something. But a priest, a pastor of some religious ilk or denominational ilk, had a serious medical attack and like almost or medically died for 30 seconds. And he said he went to hell, which I found interesting because he was like a devout believer. And he said he went to hell. They were playing Rihanna. Demons were there. It was horrible. It was painful. He said he wouldn't wish it on his worst enemy. And he said no one deserved that. And I was like, why do you still support that system then? But then at the end of the article, it talked about like what happened to him. And then a doctor literally broke it down. And they talked about it in terms of like, this is like a power plant. When you shut it off and parts of the city like lose power and everything's shutting down, that's what your brain's doing. And like, you can't rely on this. In terms of like, yeah, the other thing I think about this is like the idea of, so there's like billions of people on the planet. There's been billions of people. If you were to sort of extrapolate theoretically of how many people have had near death experiences and what the rate of that would be on a daily basis, it sounds like a stupid system for God, because then every 3 seconds someone's like, he's like, no, go back, it's not yet. No, wait, go back, not yet. Because people are like coming to him all the time, and he's like, it's not your time, it's not your time. Like, this is a poor operation. Like, you should just set it up.
Like, it makes God and like the universe sound a lot like Homer Simpson in Sector 7G. Like, oh shit, I didn't mean to push that button. Oh my gosh, go back. It was a car accident. You're gonna be okay. Like, it's
Every 10 seconds, someone is like, no, not you, not okay, you can. Yeah. So I just don't buy into that. I know, and also, like as it's been mentioned, there are many near-death experiences. Not all, but overwhelming majority tend to comport to the theological and spiritual systems of the dominant culture. So there was a guy I know they talked about who was like Muslim or Hindi, and he had a near-death experience, and then he converted to like Christianity. So like, okay, cool. But like 99.9% of all Muslims who die recount that their near-death experience conformed to Islam, and vice versa, every other one. Like, so you're simply reflecting the dominant culture that you know. I also say, like, I certainly think that most of them are very sincere. Like, I'm not doubting that they think that this didn't happen. Like, I think that they do. But there have been noise, and I know there was like a book and then a movie made about this kid. I think it's like Heaven is Real, who like 7 years old or something, and he died. And he talked to God for like a while and then came back to Earth, and then he wrote the book or whatever. One, it turns out God's about as intelligent as a 7-year-old, so and two, like it's still like his parents were like Judeo-Christian, and the kid reflected a Judeo-Christian thing. And just like kids do, they parent the things that their parents do. Like, I didn't take this as any conclusive evidence. I wasn't impressed by this. Like, oh, a 7-year-old thinks heaven is exactly the way you told him it is. Like, okay. I'm not sold on near-death experiences that they authentically reveal anything to us. Maybe some do. The question is like, how do we know? because the only other way to do it is to die, and then you really find out, and then you can't send that information back. So,
Dave, I really want you to risk this. I need you to go out on a limb here for this podcast and our
taking one for the
very
team.
wide audience. Just like, give it a whirl.
Giving
All I'm
my body
saying.
to science. Yeah. All right.
All right. Well, this is awkward. I expected that to go a lot differently. I was going to share my NDE, but now I feel it's not appropriate. So.
Hostile audience.
That's right. That's right. I don't want to share. I don't want to share mine anymore. Ugh. No, I'm kidding. No, I agree with both of you for the most part. Like,
my favorite part is about how you created an abbreviation. Like, that's just like so common. It's like, I'm just going to drop the NDE on them. They're going to automatically know what it means and not have to translate those letters into their head.
No, that's a near-death experience. The NDE is that. I mean,
Josh, I got it. It just like took me a second because
Is it common in like Paranormal Activity or something for people? Because I'd never, until you had mentioned it, I didn't know what NDE was.
Well, yeah, that and
non-disclosure agreement.
That and that alien show, Ancient Aliens.
Actually, I think this is where Josh talks about his non-disclosure agreement, whatever that might entail.
Yeah. No, but yeah, I heard the same things and pretty much agree with what you guys said. That Gary Habermas, was a big resurrection apologist, and I found it weird that he was studying a lot of NDEs, and he brought up the fact about people seeing things in other rooms and stuff but how can you really I don't know, like it's hard. I feel like those are things you would have to experience, but even if you do experience, you want to be able to trust it because your brain's not functioning as it should be. So I think they're just way too inconclusive to draw anything from, and it's kind of unfortunate that I mean, maybe they give people hope, but people who got rich off them, I just kind of makes me angry, to be honest.
I'm literally sending you guys I'm like in real time. I'm like emailing you guys an article that because I Googled that book, Heaven is for Real. I remember like my mother-in-law was like, oh my gosh, you got to read this book. And of course I didn't, but it's literally the title of the article is My Son Went to Heaven and All I Got Was a #1 bestseller. So I kind of feel like the motivations behind some of this might be a little bit beyond pure altruism and hope for like the afterlife. Like, I'm sorry, but like, it's, to me, I don't know, maybe this is kind of just my like very jaded, like cynical nature, but the moment that you kind of like commoditize something that is like non-physical and plays into people's like understandings of like the afterlife and goodness and religion and stuff, like the moment you start like commoditizing that, like that's when I'm just like,
you're Benny Hinn. Yeah.
Fuck you.
Yeah. That's my son died, went to heaven, and turns out God's a capitalist. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Get rich or die trying. That was the subtitle of the book.
Scored by 50 Cent.
That's right. All right. Last little question. Why do you think so many people believe in some form of afterlife? Is it just sort of like an evolutionary construct that kind of happened accidentally and sort of made people, have to sort of like create this based off their ignorance of the world? And if so, why does scientific explanation of the universe negate anything about afterlife and spiritual realities? Like, that's what I don't get. Like, I feel like in a way they have it both ways. Like, the people only believe in the afterlife because they're ignorant and fearful of dying, so they created these things. But why would evolution, from a materialist perspective, do it? And then why would science and the discovery of things about our physical universe rule out believing in those things about the afterlife just because of evolution? Or I don't know. What do you guys think about that whole thing? I mean, you don't have to answer my questions, but why do you think so many people believe in an afterlife, and what bearing, if any, does scientific discoveries have on the validity or, non-validity of any sort of afterlife?
Adam, you or me?
Yeah, I'll go first. So
what I'm thinking. No, I'm kidding, guys.
Oh, and we'll throw in too, why are we so afraid to die? Then if it's just a part of why are we afraid to die, period? So afraid to die.
Okay. You've covered a lot of ground in your two questions, Josh. Would you mind? Could you
Universe,
possibly
all of humanity, evolution,
history of
so
mankind,
the first one
understanding
kind
of
of like,
subconscious, and why do you fear death? Okay, go ahead.
yeah. So just a brief, just your personal opinion on why so many people of all cultures, ancient and current, believe in an afterlife, and why would scientific discoveries and evolutionary biology and things like this sort of discredit that and make you think, well, now we're in this age, we don't have to believe that anymore. Does that have any bearing on it? Let's just stick with that, and then we'll do fear.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, you're talking about like, why do people broadly believe in an afterlife, and why does science and such dispute that?
Why would it? Yeah.
Why would it?
Yeah.
Well, I think for starters, science is going to dispute anything that isn't like tangible and repeatable.
Right. Right.
So anything outside of those lines, I mean, it's kind of like, nobody likes the quality inspector because they only show up when you're doing something wrong, right? And so science is kind of like, we all certainly benefit from science, but the major criticisms of science as it exists is it kind of brings a damper on the things that we believe, the things that we like, but we can't tangibly prove. And that's not like that's not to knock any religion or faith as a whole, because I ultimately view like faith and what is tangible as being kind of separate. Like the moment like you involve what is tangible and repeatable, like to me, like that removes like that element of faith of like just kind of this hope for what you cannot prove. And I think that there's a lot of like beauty in that, regardless of the worldview, to a certain extent. But so I think that ultimately people kind of cling on to this hope of the afterlife because it seems so anticlimactic that whatever life you live, when you die, it's just simply over. And so, I mean, in various forms and in various cultures, they've adopted these types of understandings or assumptions of the afterlife based on what they are hoping for. If you were to poll many evangelical Christians about what they view of the afterlife, there'd be people that talk about like you're simply being in the presence of God, and that is enough. You would talk to other people, and they would describe a very long, emotionally driven praise and worship service for eternity. that to me would sound like hell, but that's neither here nor there. Um, then you would have other people probably just describing like reunification with like loved ones who like went on before you or follow you in death. Um, and so ultimately, I think a lot of how I use the analogy of how like people's understandings or assumptions of Jesus ultimately are a greater indicator, not of Jesus as a person or a historical figure, but ultimately um, who the person is that is providing that description. I think the same thing would apply to the afterlife. Um, the person that says that there's like absolutely nothing and like this is all it is, then maybe you're going to see somebody who's like incredibly driven and wants to leave like an impact on their world or their community or their loved ones, because they know like, hey, I'm burning out, and when I burn out and fizzle out, I'm done. There's nothing left I can do aside from like my personal narrative that people could share. Or the person that's kind of like, well, I mean, like if this is all there is, like I'm just going to enjoy it and I'm going to do what I want, and like regardless of other people's feelings or experiences or the damage that I could cause, like I'm going to do, whatever I want. And that was always the example I was given in Sunday school about the person that um, doesn't find meaning in God, the Christian God. And so ultimately, I kind of think that like people adopt a view of the afterlife or not having an afterlife as a point of hope. Even the person who doesn't believe in an afterlife, I feel like by seizing that worldview or taking that assumption, they could be going like, if that is my end game, that is my truth, like I'm going to live into that. And living into that could be meaning doing whatever they want, or it could be meaning like, no, I'm going to be very purposeful. If we're going to talk like polar opposites here, it could be like, I'm going to be very purposeful about the relationships I have, the job that I do, the work that I do, like around me, like the life that I actually live. I want it to have meaning so that when I die, I have left a legacy that's like worthy of emulating. And for the person who believes like all of this good work was not for nothing, because when I die, I'm going to experience like some other level of, extra physical experience with God. And so ultimately, like that's what I think why people assume specific beliefs about the afterlife. But I choose not to have specific beliefs about the afterlife because I don't want the end game to be my motivator for the moment in which I'm living. But that's just me.
Yeah, so you asked a lot of questions there. There were good questions.
All 30 of them.
Yeah, I would say adding on to something that Adam already said, which I agree with, like when science sort of denounces or discredits these claims about like afterlife and things like that. I don't think that they actually do. It's more of like Adam said, like science is entirely concerned about that which exists within the natural world, which obeys the laws of the natural world. Repeatable processes, they obey various laws, etc. And if you're like, well, there's this invisible unknown area elsewhere, they're kind of like, that's great, go have fun with that. Like they go out into the universe, and if they don't see that in any way, then it's irrelevant to them. So I think usually that like science is kind of like, if it does not have material properties and exist within the material world, it's irrelevant to us, so we're not going to talk about it. And that's not really the same as like saying it's not true, it's not real. There's no point in having this discussion within this scope. Yeah, in terms of like why there's this hope about an afterlife, why it's so common, I think that makes a lot of sense. You kind of asked like, why does it exist evolutionarily? Why does evolution have it? I mean, like, I don't really see evolution having a play in that, a part in that. I think sociologically, it just makes sense. We create stories to explain things about us. Again, going back to Clifford Geertz, the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. When we're confronted with things, we spin stories, we mythologize, we narrate things, either about our history, either about how things happen, or the things we don't understand. And like kind of already talked about, like things within the Bible that they didn't understand, so they created this narrative around it. They couldn't understand this. Well, that's Zeus with lightning bolts, and then we came to understand it. I think the idea of, and again, like in my view of like what Genesis is we exist. Why does that stop? Why are things bad? Why does stuff hurt? Oh, so we were going to live forever. Everything was going to be great. People screwed it up. So that's why we now die. And that's why there's no, like, it explains all of these things very nicely. I think the idea of being confronted with that end is concerning. And I can understand why people would come up with these ideas and narrations, stories about, well, there's something after. There's more things. Like we're existing, we'll continue to exist in some other way. And I think that that was kind of interesting. I think one of the ways that like I think is interesting to think about this is, and I put some of the things in the notes, but like thinking about the afterlife and the way we think about it seems so strange to me about like, why don't we believe that there's a pre-life? Like there was a life before this life. Like that doesn't seem to be very common unless you accept sort of like reincarnation as a process. But like we think that there'll be a life after this life, but it's not very common to think there's a life before this. Why do we tend to think that the life after this life is one unending, super long one? The only thing we've ever experienced is like a life that begins and starts. Why don't we have life that just kind of keeps going on? There's another one and another one, similar to sort of our view about like the universe. There was a beginning point, and we think that it'll stop, but then it'll probably just start another one. And then maybe that one eventually will stop, and then there'll be another one, and like the universe will sort of keep recreating itself. Why doesn't the afterlife just have another afterlife and another afterlife and another? Why do we think it's this one particular way? And I think, again, because that makes more sense to say, oh, well, the afterlife, you live about 100 years and then you die. And then well, what happens after that? And like, there's another one. It's just, you just say like, that one just keeps going and it's great the whole time. And it just continues that process forever. And that answers all, we can contextualize and compartmentalize all of our questions into this. And we have fixed this into a nice little box that I think summarizes everything that we kind of are uncertain of or kind of scared or concerned about, which is death and the afterlife, etc. I think that's why it exists. And I think it soothes us. It gives us, you know, like you said, you talked a couple times about like, it gives us hope of not worrying so much about the unknown things. The last thing I'll say about this, that for me and my take on this is like, I do think that it gives people hope, undeniably. My personal motivation is not whether something gives me hope, it's whether something's true or not. And I once heard someone put this really well about like the idea of like, well, the idea of heaven or God like soothes people and it gives them hope and it makes them feel better. If you believed that you had won the lottery and you had just, you know, earned whatever, $750 million, that would give you a lot of hope. That'd give you a lot of positivity. You'd probably live your life differently. A lot of things that concern or scare you or worry you would sort of be alleviated. But that doesn't speak to the fact of whether you actually did. And if you didn't win it, but you think you did, there could be problems. Nevertheless, like I recognize that like the idea of the afterlife and heaven does make people feel good and it gives them hope. But that doesn't speak to whether it's actually true. Just like thinking you are a multi-millionaire would give you a lot of ease and a lot of like ease concerns, and you'd be a very much more positive person. But it doesn't mean it's actually true. And that tends to be where I grapple with these conversations is like, I'm more concerned about whether it's true or not. But, gosh.
Yep. Well, that's good. So it is true that we will all, including the universe and all human life, will collapse into the eternal abyss. So we have that to look forward to. No, it's good discussion, guys. We've been going at it now for almost an hour and a half.
Oh, wait, are you going to say what you think about?
Yeah, don't you try
society?
to dodge the question. You.
I mean, I didn't really have any I didn't have any thoughts formulated on it. I was just trying to think of some more talking points. So
I don't actually contemplate these things. I walk through my life with my mouth open, staring up at This guy.
No, I mean, I think I think that I mean, if I think that there is a ground of being that made everything, so I think that there's some form of like longing that makes sense, because if God exists, we should not want to die and want to continue to live and flourish. And um, I mean, and I agree too about the a scientific perspective. Science doesn't deal with anything. It's only empirical data that can, be tested and shown what's going on now. But there's still a lot of mysterious things, in the scientific world that, like consciousness itself, and why we are prone to be kind of bent towards spirituality.
Where does
Um,
Weird Al Yankovic come up with those sweet beats?
exactly. There's a lot of mysteries that we may never know. But no,
He
so that's
steals
about
them.
it. What's that?
He
Yeah, he does
covers
steal.
them.
He does steal. No,
Wait,
so yeah, I didn't really have too much anything like to
wait.
add
So I
on.
want to. Can I come back? So were you saying it sounded like that, like the longing or the impetus behind human society sort of creating these stories about the afterlife and the foreverness of existence kind of comes from our attempt to reconnect, that like we're stamped sort of with the, I can't remember your term, but with the creator, I'll use that term. And so because there's that like we're sort of drawn from that, we're trying to like reconnect with that, or like we feel that itch, to use really bad language, and so
Yeah,
we're trying to do it.
I think that makes sense. Like I think our experience um and who we are as people, I think it would make sense if there was a ground of reality that, you know, is a mind that would, if it created other rational beings that would have um, these ways to connect with it or to hope to be in communion with it. And if we have those longings, I mean, C.S. Lewis says something similar about, if we have those certain longings, there's something to satisfy those longings. You know, so I just think it's another thing. We long for life, we long for justice, well being. Um, and not everyone does. A lot of people say they don't want to live forever. Maybe they really don't want to live forever. But I, I, I think there's an innate desire to live well for as long as you possibly can. And if that is a desire, if that can be accomplished, I think that is the ideal state of people, and I think that's what ultimately God will accomplish with people. That there will be a state of how you'd want life to, not how you want life to be, but how life will be in an ideal state, and we'll realize it when it actually occurs. Um, in the next life, not obviously this life. And obviously, the, even that, I'm just saying it as a hopeful. All this is just a hopeful expectation too. I mean, there's no way of proving it. It's sort of just like signposts that point. Oh, well, this makes sense if this, and what's the alternative? So I
Yeah.
always tend to. It's like it's for me. It's like it's one's happy and makes sense and is like wishful thinking in a sense, because the other, it might be true, but it's just, it makes me too dark and gloomy. So even if it were true, I don't think it'd be healthy for me to even think that in this existence, because of where it would take someone like me, if that makes sense.
Quick question on that. So like, sorry, and then we're done. You kind of said something about this before, like if this is the only life and therefore then it has really no lasting meaning, then like it would, like I think you were saying like I wouldn't, but like I understand the impulse to be like, well then like I'll just be a hedonist and it doesn't matter because I'll just like rape, kill, and destroy because this
I
life doesn't
wouldn't
mean.
rape or kill.
Okay. Just destroy. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, so my question then is, if let's say you live this life and then you die and you go to an afterlife, some sort of heavenish thing, would you have that feeling then? Because like there's nothing after that life. And so wouldn't you be like, so then if there's nothing after this life, then it doesn't matter what I do here either then. So I'm gonna rape, kill, and destroy there.
Well, in that life, there wouldn't be, you know, all thing, you know, the in that life, there theoretically wouldn't be anything lacking. So there wouldn't even be any good desire that would be unfulfilled. All good desires, all good things would be in fruition. So you would be in a state of completeness. Where here, there's just so much lacking in well-being and the good that you can only hope for that new reality. And even though if you don't know really what it might look like or pan out to be, um, there's still that idea of it being better there, fulfillment happening there, wholeness being there. Where here, it's more things are out of whack, you know. And the fact that I have kids and stuff does change the game a lot too. You know, like Adam said, if you have a family or you're a significant other and you have things that hold you accountable, and you have to, I think those are good things, and I think that's part of a design that way. I think, but it just goes to show if there's an idea, if you're a young single person and there's an idea of, well, what is keeping me here? What is providing me with hope or stability or meaning, well-being? Like, what's this all about? What's it all for? I think it just has the potential to take people down um, a dangerous path. Not even dangerous, a depressing path. But I don't know. That's kind of getting off topic into another
Yeah. I mean, the
thing.
youth are so hedonistic anyways. I mean,
That's true. That's true. That's true. But anyway, we can close it there. Good discussion. Good talk, guys. Yeah, we almost at like an hour and 40 minutes or so. Anyone else have any closing thoughts or anything?
no, this was good.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, gentlemen, it was a pleasure speaking with you on this 5th episode of Three Friends Who Hate Each Other. And we look forward to seeing you all again, those of you at home and who are listening in their cars.
Oh, yes. Real side note, though, I did want to say, because I've been waiting for so long to tell Adam this, and I did want to let him know.